Welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Li Xin. In this series, I'll dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to our panelists to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. Today, I'm asking, is politicizing COVID-19 the new virus that's spreading among media? Are some media putting politics before people? There is no doubt the coronavirus has gone global. According to the World Health Organization, 85 countries and territories outside China have reported almost 15,000 confirmed cases and 270 deaths as of Thursday. Over 80% of the cases outside China are in just 4 countries: South Korea, Italy, Iran, and Japan. Now, China has over 80,000 confirmed cases and has reported over 3,000 fatalities. 90% of China's cases are in central China's Hubei province. Now, more than 50,000 patients have been cured and released worldwide. Regardless of their political systems or number of cases, countries around the world are stepping up efforts to contain the further spread of the virus. Even countries that have yet to be hit hard are rolling out prevention and control measures. The fear is real and understandable. People want to know what they can do to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. Governments are doing what they can to spread awareness and keep people vigilant without triggering panic. However, instead of looking at the bigger battle against a common threat, some media have decided to shift the conversation from people to politics. They're asking, is COVID-19 China's Chernobyl moment? Chernobyl, of course, refers to the radioactive disaster in 1986 that some say ushered in the downfall of the former Soviet Union. The government at the time infamously tried to cover up the disaster and prevent the residents from knowing how serious the situation was. Now, no matter which crisis China is battling, some media seem bound and determined to promote the idea that it's China's Chernobyl moment. Our first example even speaks to this phenomenon. The Atlantic published the opinion piece, "China's Chernobyl Never Seems to Rise," by Roy Drew on February the 17th. He starts with, for a cottage industry of Western experts, the fall of the Chinese Communist Party is always just one crisis away. The deadly Wenchuan earthquake in Sichuan province and collision of high-speed trains in Wenzhou are just 2 of the examples he uses. He says each of these catastrophes are going to be China's version of Chernobyl, the nuclear leak that revealed and accelerated the terminal decline of the Soviet Union. But that moment has never come. And, he writes, Americans should be skeptical of any coming collapse of China predictions. Why? Because, he argues, the Communist Party of China has a well-defined playbook for handling the deadly crises that have arisen on its watch. Let's take a look at this playbook the author has cobbled together. Step 1. Find a local official to take the blame. The author argues that what he calls China fragmented authoritarian allows for easy scapegoating in times of crisis. For the coronavirus, local officials in Wuhan and Hubei have been blamed for mishandling the outbreak. Jiang Chaoliang, the highest-ranking official in Hubei, recently resigned in disgrace, he writes. Okay, but I want to know, what's the alternative here? Is the author implying that the local officials in Wuhan who did not take the appropriate measures in the crisis should stay in power? I hope not. Step 2, according to the author, respond aggressively, even excessively. When a crisis arises, the central government will take great pains to show that it cares. Well, I should hope so. What government doesn't? When faced with a new virus, a crisis of unknown magnitude, should China's response been a bit more laissez-faire, more of a let's hope for the best and just see what happens approach? I don't think the world would have liked that very much. Step 3, according to the author, control the narrative. In China's political education system, citizens are taught to internalize the idea of struggle. China's rejuvenation will come only if citizens join together to work hard, solve problems, and develop the country. Yes, Last time I checked, working together and solving problems is exactly what a country's citizens should be doing when faced with a crisis, or even if there is no crisis. The world would not be a safer place right now if China was not unified, working hard, or solving problems. Let's be clear, nobody is thrilled about this virus, not in China, not anywhere else in the world. And no, life isn't great when you have to struggle or to take new steps to protect yourselves and others, but we can also agree that nobody wants this virus to spread. If promoting and encouraging people to focus on what can be done is called controlling the narrative, so be it. I understand it's amusing for China experts like this author to try to boil down the party's crisis management strategy into a three-step manual, but we all know it's not as simple as that. China's system works not because it's using a playbook to hide problems or misguide the people. It works because, given the country's sheer size and population, the system's efficiency has proved effective in handling natural disasters and man-made problems alike. If there is a problem with the system, rest assured it will be identified, analyzed, and improved. Speaking of controlling the narrative, our next example comes from the New York Times, which published the piece, "China Spins Coronavirus Crisis, Hailing Itself as a Global Leader," on February the 28th. Now, there is a lot in this piece I would like to address, but in the interest of time, I'll just bust the headline. First, spins coronavirus crisis. The article says, as the virus spreads to 56 countries and wreaks havoc on global markets, experts say the campaign could revive concerns about China's secretive approach to managing the crisis. Secretive? Call China's approach anything you like, but secretive is really a stretch. Every day, China gives real-time updates of its infection numbers for every province, every city, every county, through social media or on TV, in addition to giving daily press conferences to update the world on exactly what it is doing. Really an information overload, some might argue. And these figures don't always paint a very rosy picture. So please stop questioning the data. To me, it seems no matter how much information China shares with some in the international community, it will never be enough. Secondly, hailing itself as a global leader. Nice try, but at no point has China ever hailed itself as a global leader. The article tries to spin it this way when it says the government is now working to promote the idea that international experts enthusiastically endorse its approach. And memes have circulated featuring recent praise from a World Health Organization expert for China's efforts. One shows the expert and a quote from a recent news conference in which he said he would want to be treated in China if he were infected with the virus. But you see, this isn't work because it's true. International experts did and continue to endorse China's approach, and anyone can see for themselves. Report of the WHO China's Joint Mission on Coronavirus Disease 2019 states that in the face of a previously unknown virus, China has rolled out perhaps the most ambitious, agile and aggressive disease containment effort in history. Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, tweeted in late January, "Today I met with Xi Jinping, President of China, in Beijing to discuss next steps in battle against the new coronavirus outbreak. The WHO appreciates the seriousness with which China is taking this outbreak and the transparency authorities have demonstrated." But again, it doesn't seem to matter who said what about China. So long as it is positive, there must be something suspicious about it. Finally, we have another opinion piece published by the Australian Financial Review on March the 2nd. Former Australian ambassador to China, Jeff Raby, writes why COVID-19 is unlikely to be Xi's Chernobyl moment. Mr. Raby gives a no-frills account of how the Chinese government has handled recent crises. He makes the argument, yes, China has its challenges with how it manages situations and political discussions, but that doesn't mean the government is going to collapse anytime soon. He says, clearly, a great deal of public mistrust of the government exists, Equally, there is overwhelming support for the government's narrative that this is a challenge that only the country united under the wise leadership of the Communist Party can confront and defeat, and that foreign commentators generally fail to recognize that support for the party is genuine and widespread. Many outsiders seem to look at the Chinese people and the Chinese government as separate, feuding entities, when actually they are interwoven. He also clears up all the confusion surrounding this irresistible Chernobyl comparison when he says, China today is not the Soviet Union of 1986. China is a highly successful, well-functioning economy that keeps delivering even higher material living standards to its citizens, while its international standing is built on respect. Cynicism exists, but is trumped by the Communist Party's patriotic narrative and the government's performance in delivering on people's expectations. Yes, like radiation, the virus is invisible but dangerous. And yes, China and Chernobyl both start with the same two letters. That's true, but let's stop trying to compare these two, please. We've got more important things to do. Big thanks to the Atlantic piece, though, for inspiring me to write a playbook of my own to help people understand the steps media takes to cover China stories. It would go something like this. First, accuse the Chinese government of doing too little or too much. No matter how much or how little they do, it's wrong. Secondly, call it fake news. Always question the numbers and anything positive other countries or international organizations say about China. Thirdly, control the narrative. Share analysis from anyone outside China, but don't use anything positive from within China. Welcome back, and joining me from Hong Kong is James Chau, Goodwill Ambassador with the World Health Organization and host of The China Current, a digital show about our global future, and from Paris, Professor Joav Toker from the American Graduate School in Paris, who specializes in media and global communications. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So it was a long monologue once again, and the comparison of the COVID-19 with Chernobyl moment. We've talked about it, but once again, I want to hear your insights. James, first of all, why do you think it is so compelling, this comparison that so many people are talking about, or we're talking about? Have I missed something?
When I first heard about it, Liu Xin, I was a little bit taken aback. I think it was a couple of weeks ago where I saw Chernobyl mentioned in relation to COVID-19 somewhere on Twitter, and it took me aback because I didn't really recognize the direct comparison that they were making. I think it's very, very different. If you look at Chernobyl, it was the failure during a safety test of one of the units in the Chernobyl nuclear complex, and it was a man-made disaster, so to speak. I think, you know, this is very different when we talk about COVID-19. It's a disaster of nature. It's a humanitarian disaster. Chernobyl was also a humanitarian disaster. Tens of thousands of people perhaps could be affected to this day with related cancers, but it was very different. The causes are very different. And I think somehow making a side-by-side comparison dishonors not only the people who died in Chernobyl and who continue to suffer today, but it dishonors the thousands of people who have died in Wuhan, the tens of thousands who are infected there, and the thousands more who are infected, and some of them dying around the world. I don't get the direct comparison. I understand sometimes we need a benchmark by which to understand and to place and position and to compartmentalize the tragedies in our modern history, but I think this was just a wrong comparison to make.
Professor Toker, what is your opinion concerning this comparison? And also, one of the points that keep coming up is the lack of transparency in the government's response, or the government attempt to cover up the disaster or mistrust of the government, which led to the eventual collapse of the system. Professor Toker.
Indeed, this is an element which you find all across Western press, and perhaps beyond the Western world, in the strict world. I would, if I may, I would introduce some relativization in all that. If I had to address the list of deformed or biased or prejudiced articles, let them be news pieces or let them be op-ed pieces, regarding what is happening across the border. Let it be the American policy, or French policy, or British policy, or Israeli policy, or Norwegian policy. I could really go into a long list with a lot of prejudice and a lot of elements which are far from being exact and far from transposing what people familiar with the real situation on the terrain would say. There's nothing exceptional about it, and I haven't found, as far as I could judge over the last few weeks, with this horrible virus crisis in China and then all across the planet right now, I haven't found exceptional diversions and deviations regarding the position of the so-called Western press regarding the Chinese situation. But I will add that in the punctual context we are in right now, I think we shouldn't deny the fact that there is a sort of media war, or at least media confrontation, between China on one hand and the United States on the other. And this so-called media war, or perhaps media confrontation would be a rather more suitable term, is a part of a larger context of a commercial and trade confrontation. So one should add that into the overall filtering system, looking upon particular texts of particular articles of particular newspaper or other media outlets in the West.
James, would you like to react to that? Would you like to add something onto that? I think Professor Toker pointed out something very interesting, which is the overall media environment when it comes to China. My impression is like this is whenever there is something bad, some disaster or big failure in China, some in the international media just jumps. You know, they couldn't hold back their excitement to write and depict that this is the crisis that will bring down the system. My impression, but James, your impression?
Well, I think the professor said it very well. I think, Lucien, you mentioned a word which is very important, which is talk about mistrust. I think that there is mistrust in our governments and institutions all around the world, and I think a lot of that can be very healthy. It is right for us to question our leaders, but it's also right for us to trust our leaders and our institutions. You know, there was a very interesting clip that came up on Twitter yesterday of Jürgen Klopp, you know, the legendary German soccer coach, and he was asked about COVID-19 and for his take on the global outbreak of it, and he said, and he stopped the reporter very quickly, and he said, you know, why are you asking me? I'm a football coach. I wear a baseball cap. I don't shave very well. There are plenty of experts out there, and he said he was not one of them to talk about these public health measures. And I think it goes back, you know, mistrust in governments and institutions is happening everywhere, from the liberal democracies to the not so liberal democracies. But I think there comes a time where we really do need to put faith amongst people who are trained and who are skilled. Over at WHO, I know that Dr. Tedros meets with his staff. I think it's every Friday when he's in town. He leaves the door open. Everyone can go in. They can bring everything up in a trusted and safe environment one-on-one with him. He works with the interns like that as well who come to the organization. And so it's right that people should question the feasibility and also how well our leaders are delivering on us. They are our leaders. They deliver for our health as well. But I think also at the same time we need to balance it, and we can't just throw out things out there. As a consequence, though, and I have to say, looking forward and being positive, because I think that we do have to keep positive in the middle of an outbreak, which of course we're in the midst of one right now. You know, the communications at WHO, and you see the communications amongst other quarters, have really tightened up. They're working with fantastic social media platforms, platforms like Facebook and Google, that in the past have been accused of censoring context around political election cycles, have really stepped up to the mark here and beyond. So I wouldn't say it's all bad, but I think net, there can be some real damage, as he said.
You mentioned a keyword which is really important. For instance, you said balance. And I think there is a very fine act which I think every government, every international organization is trying to keep at this moment. For instance, you have the media who scrutinizes, okay, who question, who challenge, that's their job. But on the other hand, the public also needs desperately some sense of reassurance, some sense of confidence that they can, a minimum level of confidence and trust they can have in the system so that they can go through this together. So, Professor Toker, while it is natural for media, for journalists to question, to hold somebody to account, on the other hand, how can they help people also rest assured that there is a minimum level of trust they can have in the system, either the domestic system or the international system?
I agree with you. There is, of course, a level of how should we call it, sort of an excess of confidence between, on one hand, political leaderships, all political leaderships, let them be in Beijing, in Washington, in Paris, in Berlin, or in Rome, and the more efficient, the more way of handling a crisis, let it be a sanitary crisis or any other crisis for that matter. And actually, if you follow Western so-called capitalist-type democracy press outlets, you'd see that. It was so clear over the last few weeks when for some time China was, if not alone, practically alone on world scene fighting the danger of the epidemic and the epidemic situation. And then most Western countries which had this elusive idea that China is having this problem, but we in the West do not have it. This, of course, have changed radically over the last 2-3 weeks, and now you don't find this kind of discourse anymore. And then you would have all kind of analysis, I guess many of those just really detached from reality, regarding what is happening between the leadership in China, the Chinese Communist Party and its relations with people and all that, and I really wouldn't trust those commentaries too much. But you'd find these days in Italy, in France, in Britain, in Switzerland, a lot of press outlet talking about the fact that yes, political leaderships have a dilemma. They have to incarnate confidence and give the people the sense of they know what they're doing, they're behaving in a cautious and prudent and responsible way, facing danger of which we do not know exactly and are not familiar with the parameters. And on the other hand, political leaderships have to maintain the level of confidence invested towards them from the people. So the dilemma crosses borders and crosses political systems and is valid for so-called democratic countries and non-democratic countries through Western criteria, and transitional systems which are sort of halfway or two-thirds of the way between these two basic, radically different systems.
Yeah. Let's take a look at some comments or some questions we have gotten on the social media. For instance, this one by Carlos Perez Ferra, which says, what it looks to me from here is that it may well be the Western Chernobyl moment. Also, it shows how a propaganda weapon can easily turn against its wielder. The issue is turning out to be a very layered and puffy experience of what the 21st century could look like. Thoughts? Let me go to James. James, okay, let's try to avoid doing the same mistake that we don't like, that we wanted to call out. Let's not say this is the Western Chernobyl moment, but what do you think is revealing as we are going into more days and seeing more cases arising in countries around the world? What is teaching you? What is telling you?
Oh, I've learned so much, and Lucien, I think this is another excellent question. And what you said, we shouldn't, hit back in the world. What I said on your show a couple of days ago was that the concept of borders and countries have melted away in some respects with globalization and the beautiful, beautiful interconnectedness that brings, that we should see ourselves really as one human race. I was speaking to Neil Bush, the son and brother of former US presidents, and his organization, the George Bush China Foundation, has donated 2 million masks to health workers in China. And I asked him why, and he said very simply, because my father and I always believe that we are one human race. I would equally say that this is not the West's Chernobyl moment. I hope that what is learnt in China can be extended across there, maybe even as an olive branch in some respect. I know that the World Health Organization may be a building in Geneva, but really it's made up of more than 190 member states of billions of people that represents in itself. So we should really be working together. I know that sounds somewhat of a cliche sometimes,
right.
but in times of tragedy, which this is.
Unfortunately,
yes, in times of tragedy that this is.
Yeah, I really do think that there are more work that's done across the border, but the political differences sometimes just seemed so big, and it's almost like politically incorrect for some countries to ask China for information
yes.
or for their best practices. Professor Toker, how do you look at this? What really has to happen for countries really is to reach out to each other and say, let's do it together, despite all of the political differences that has been separating us?
Who cannot honestly and idealistically resist the idea of my colleague in Hong Kong about one human race and the type of solidarity which is part of that? I'm afraid that the type of situation we're talking about and the type of situation the planet is in right now actually is far from being favorable to that. On the contrary, when you have rational and irrational elements, scientific ones and still question marks in terms of science and medicine, which are still valid regarding this epidemic, you cannot expect public opinions and individuals, wherever they are, whatever political system they live, actually to go through towards this approach of we are one race, one planet, one solidarity. Unfortunately, this type of situation encourages rather panic, rather irrational sort of deviations, and of course the far away other protagonists are, it's so much easier to once again go back to prejudice, to elements which are fed by ignorance, by fear, by just distance, by cultural sort of distances, and it's natural, however regretting.
Yeah, well, it takes courage to say, despite, let's put our differences aside and do something together, even to people that you have criticized in the past. I want to leave you with one last comment from this netizen friend by the name of Li Shuo, which among several posts he says the reaction government takes doesn't have a positive correlation with the severity of the epidemic, so we cannot say that it is a Chernobyl moment or a recoverable blow since the Chinese government took serious reactions. I think we've talked a lot about Chinese government reactions and so on and so forth. But James, before we wrap up this discussion, anything else you think that is really important that people need to keep in mind?
Two really quick points, Lucy. One is that let's keep politics out of health. Our health is a sacred area. Let's not involve politics in it. That's number one. And secondly, I spoke to Gabriel Leung, who was part of the WHO international mission that went to China, and I asked him when he came back, what did you learn? And he said, it's not a Chinese disease, it's not a South Korean disease, it's not Italian, Iranian, or even an American disease. Unfortunately, it's a tragedy that's seeped into the world, but it belongs to all of us, and we're all in the same global boat together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James Chau, joining us from Hong Kong, and Professor Joav Toker joining us from Paris. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. I'll see you next Friday on the same show. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.